Hi there, I'm Michelle, and welcome back to the Canadian History, a Chronology channel. Today's episode, number 11, continues with First Contact. This focus will be on Samuel de Champlain, the third of the three C's after John Cabot and Jacques Cartier. I'll just take a moment, though, to apologize in advance for this being a bit longer than I wanted, but there's a lot of ground to cover in this period. Now, as mentioned in a previous video, Jacques Cartier made his last voyage in 1541. Following Cartier, the explorations of Samuel de Champlain, called the father of New France, really set the settlement gears into motion for the French, but just barely. He managed, against many odds, to establish and maintain a permanent French colony on the North American mainland. This was when the shift went from exploration to settlement. It was the fur trade and exuberant missionaries that fueled the French colonies, and Champlain was a champion of both. But before getting into the life and times of Champlain and the French, there were others, the English before him, that we cannot forget as part of the founding or invasion of Canada. Seems like everyone still believed that by sailing west one would eventually reach the Orient. These explorations became known as the Quest for the Northwest Passage. The English, specifically Queen Elizabeth I, sent Martin Frobisher in 1576. Frobisher reached Baffin Island, just west of Greenland, and entered a large bay, now known as Frobisher Bay. But it was not a route to the Orient. It was a dead end. Frobisher returned in 1578, but this voyage too was a failure. Then there was Henry Hudson. In 1610, Henry Hudson set sail in search of the Northwest Passage with a crew of 22. Hudson managed to go further than Frobisher and entered a huge bay, now called Hudson Bay. He sailed further south into the bay, hoping for warmer climates, but came to a dead end too. That's the funny thing about bays. They're dead ends. Then winter came, and they became frozen in the ice with very little supplies. Unfortunately for Hudson, when spring finally came, he wanted to continue his journey, but the crew had had enough and mutinied. They tied him up and set him adrift without food or water in a small boat. With him were his young son Jack and a handful of supporters. Hudson was never seen or heard from again. Now, putting the search for the Northwest Passage aside, England wanted to control the coast of Newfoundland and the Grand Banks. Fishing cod was the beef of the sea for a hungry population. Humphrey Gilbert tried in 1583 and failed, but his claim is considered as the beginning of the British Empire in North America. Gilbert and his entire crew died when his ship sank on the way back to England. Then, in 1610, the first true official attempt at establishing a permanent colony in Newfoundland was undertaken by the English. John Guy was appointed to be the colony's first governor. With only 39 colonists, Guy landed at Cooper's Cove, now called Cupid's, and cleared the land and farmed. 2 years later, 16 women joined them. Finally, in 1615, Guy left Newfoundland, never to return, and by 1631, the colony had more or less collapsed. So now the English control the Hudson's Bay and Newfoundland areas, and the French control the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes areas. Okay, now let's get back to some French colonization. In 1604, there were no European settlements north of Florida, and a French trader, Pierre Desmonts, decided to fix that. With him, surprise, was a young Samuel de Champlain, acting as a mapmaker and navigator. Desmonts entered the Bay of Fundy, where he built a settlement on a small island in the St. Croix River. Unfortunately, it was a very bad winter, and by the time French supply ships returned, 36 of the 80 settlers had died from scurvy. Desmonts then moved everyone across the Bay of Fundy to a cove he called Port Royal, where he built another small settlement. Desmonts left Port Royal in 1607, never returned to the New World, but he did invest in a second colony, inland up the St. Lawrence River, led by none other than Samuel de Champlain. In 1608, Champlain sailed up the St. Lawrence River to where the river narrows and came upon a very large natural cliff rock formation. At the base of these cliffs, Champlain built his habitation, the future site of Quebec City. But it wasn't easy for the settlers. The first winter there, 20 of the 28 settlers died. And if you remember from previous videos on Jacques Cartier, this was the site of the village of Stadacona, where Cartier kidnapped Chief Donnacona of the St. Lawrence Iroquois. And further downriver was a much larger Iroquois village of Hochelaga. Unfortunately, by this time, 70 years later, both villages and their peoples were gone. Intertribal warfare and disease, most likely brought by Cartier, finished these peoples off. What was different about Champlain compared to the other explorers? Well, Champlain looked inland. Before him, all activities revolved around the shores. Under Champlain, the St. Lawrence River became a fur trading artery and a major highway into the interior. He figured that if you control the St. Lawrence River, you control the interior. And if you control the interior, you control Canada. Champlain explored the waterways and Great Lakes, making rather accurate maps as he went, and tirelessly went back and forth to France to promote the colony and seek investors. He built his habitation upriver at Quebec. The name Quebec was actually taken from an Algonquin word, Quebec, meaning where the river narrows. In 1609, the local Montagnais natives asked Champlain to join them on an expedition against the Iroquois to the south. Champlain agreed, not wanting to upset his fur trading allies. But unfortunately, this decision had far-reaching impacts that lasted generations. For the next 6 years, Champlain would take part in several raids against the Iroquois, making lifelong enemies of them and the Mohawks. In 1615, Champlain traveled to the Georgian Bay area of the Great Lakes at the invitation of the Hurons to trade. He was wounded here when raiding against the Iroquois, but recovered and returned to Quebec with a fleet of canoes filled with furs. Now Champlain had an alliance between the French and the Hurons, but this plunged the French into a war with the Iroquois Confederacy. But in Champlain's mind, the best furs came from the north, and that was Huron territory. To encourage trade with the Hurons, Champlain sent out men to live among them, to learn their language and customs, and to learn the land. These adventurers were called coureurs de bois, or runners of the woods, and helped bridge the gap between Europeans and First Nations. These men were the forerunners of the voyageurs, or travelers, who would go inland in canoes and collect furs. The original of these men was Etienne Brulé, who spent 20 years living among the Hurons. Another famous fur trader was Médard de Groseilliers. Although French, Groseilliers worked for the English at this time. His explorations for the English led to the founding of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670, which is now the oldest corporation in Canada and still in business today. Up till now, New France was basically just a trading post. Champlain needed settlers. In 1617, Champlain asked Louis Hébert, a pharmacist from Paris and a former Acadian colonist, to settle in New France. Louis, his wife Marie, and their 3 children cleared land in New France and became known as the original habitants, the first true farmers and settlers in New France. But Champlain was not just thinking about settlement. He also wanted to save the savages. He wanted to civilize them. To that end, he invited the Récollet friars from near his hometown in France to come and start missionary work. Not only would this help reinforce the relationship between the natives and the French, Champlain thought, but it would also save them from eternal hellfire in the afterlife. With the arrival of the Récollet friars, the First Nations people would come under a different form of invasion. Their beliefs and culture were now at risk. 10 years later, following the Récollet friars, came the Jesuits. The Jesuits, also known as God's Marines, were fearless and driven in their mission to convert the natives. Unfortunately for the Hurons, the Jesuits were the beginning of the end for the Huron Confederacy. Tensions then rose between the fur traders, who were predominantly Protestant, and the Catholic Jesuits. The fur traders did not want religion messing with the culture and their trade with the natives. So the Jesuits complained to Cardinal Richelieu back in France, and guess who he sided with? In 1627, all trade monopolies in New France were cancelled, and Cardinal Richelieu established the Company of 100 Associates with himself as the head. Go figure. Unfortunately, their focus seemed to have been more spiritual capitalism rather than profit. Then, for a brief period, the English Kirke brothers captured Quebec in 1628. They were privateers. They starved out the colony of Quebec, and Champlain was forced to surrender and was then taken back to England as a prisoner. New France remained in English hands for 4 years and would have continued this way if it wasn't for a stroke of luck. In England, the good King Charles was out of money and sold the New France colonies back to the French for a large lump sum payment. So the dream of New France was back on the table. Samuel de Champlain returned to Quebec in 1633. He went on to establish a post at Trois-Rivières in 1634, then died on Christmas Day, 1635. At the time of Champlain's death, fewer than 200 people were living in New France. But his life's work led to New France being established. Without him, there would not have been a New France, or a Quebec, or a French-Canadian presence in Canada. And what about the English, the Kirke brothers? David Kirke was given title to the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland and became the first governor of Newfoundland. Well, that's it for the short history of Samuel de Champlain and the English in the New World. Please stay tuned for more on First Contact with a special episode, episode 12, My Ancestors. Why my ancestors? Because my own ancestors were part of these original habitants of New France. Now remember, at any time, feel free to leave comments or questions below, and I'll do my best to respond to them all. And please, be a true Canadian and be polite. And if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and give it a thumbs up. And hit the bell if you'd like to be notified of any new content. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.